Eleanor Grace Hartwell folded her mother's locket into the trunk with both hands, and her hands did not shake. She did not weep. She did not ask for an explanation twice. She did not raise her voice to be heard over the murmur still drifting up from the drawing room below, where 30 guests were finishing wine they had not paid for, and discussing a woman they had just watched be discarded. She closed the trunk's lid with a small final click, the way a ledger is closed at the end of a quarter that has not gone well. By morning there would be 3 trunks waiting in the hall instead of 1, and the Duke of Renfield would spend the next year of his life learning the precise value of the thing he had just called worthless. 3 years before, summer had come to Denford the way it always did, heavy and green, and entirely indifferent to the arrangements men were making inside their fine houses. Eleanor had arrived at Wrenmore Hall in a hired carriage with her father's solicitor beside her, and a marriage contract in her lap, £20,000 of Hartwell wool money folded into clauses that made her, in the language the county preferred not to say aloud, a bought bride. Her father, Josiah Hartwell, had built his fortune on fair wages and honest weight, and he had spent a fortune buying his only daughter a title that would never quite forgive her for needing to be bought. The Duke had married her in a ceremony attended by 11 people, and had not looked at her directly until the vows required it. He was not cruel. That distinction mattered to her from the first week, and she kept it the way she kept every fact that might later prove useful. He was cold, and coldness, she came to understand, is not cruelty's cousin, but its opposite. Cruelty wants to wound you. Coldness simply forgets you exist. Julian Ashford, Duke of Renfield, moved through his own house like a man auditing a property he intended to sell. Precise, correct, entirely absent. He had 2 children from a first marriage. Henry, 8, all elbows and unanswered questions, and Cecilia, 5, who had stopped asking her father for anything at all some time before Eleanor arrived, and had never quite started again. Eleanor did what she had been raised to do with a thing that was broken, and did not yet know it. She worked. She took the estate's account books, 3 years neglected, and found the debts hiding inside them the way rot hides inside a beam that still looks sound. She found tenant cottages with roofs that had been promised repair since before her marriage, and had the promise kept within a season. She found Henry's Latin tutor charging for lessons he did not give, and Cecilia's nursery maid feeding the children cold porridge and warm porridge to herself. None of it made her visible. It made her useful, which she was learning, slowly and without self-pity, was not the same thing at all. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 14, and had left her exactly one habit that mattered more than the wool trade itself. Never let them see what a thing costs you. Grief, when it came, was to be counted out in minutes, not years, 10 minutes behind a closed door, and then the door opened again and the ledger resumed. Eleanor had used the habit on the day her mother died. She used it now, in a house that warmed for everyone but her. On the mornings the Duke passed her in the corridor with a nod that acknowledged a housekeeper more than a wife. The children were the one place the habit failed her, because she had not meant to love them, and had done it anyway, without noticing the exact hour it happened. Cecilia had begun climbing into her lap during lessons sometime in the second winter. Henry had begun bringing her his sums before he brought them to his father, because his father corrected them, and Eleanor explained them. She had not been hired for this. No clause in the contract her father's solicitor had drafted mentioned love, bought or otherwise. It had simply accumulated, the way warmth accumulates in a house through 100 small fires and not one great one. until one day the house is warm and no one can say precisely when it happened. Into that accumulation, in the third summer, came Lady Priscilla Vane. She was the sister of the Duke's first wife, Rosalind, dead 4 years now of a fever the doctors had called sudden, and Julian had never quite called anything at all. Priscilla arrived at Renmore with black gloves, a dead husband's debts, and a smile the county had learned to trust precisely because it never moved. She was smooth as poured cream, and twice as difficult to hold. She called Eleanor my dear, in a voice that filed the words under a different ledger entirely, and within a fortnight she had begun asking, gently, in company, whether it was quite usual for a duke's children to be raised so entirely by a stranger's daughter. A cit's daughter, she did not say, though everyone in the room supplied the words themselves. Eleanor watched her the way she watched a column of figures that did not sum correctly. Something was being hidden inside the totals. She did not yet know what. She only knew, the way she had always known when a number lied, that a reckoning was coming, and that when it arrived, someone would try to make it look like it had arrived because of her. On the last Thursday in August, an invitation came for a dinner to mark the 3rd anniversary of her marriage. Julian had not proposed it. Priscilla had arranged it, with his distracted permission, in the manner of a woman arranging her own stage. Eleanor dressed for it in blue, the only colour Cecilia had once told her looked like it belonged to her, and went down the stairs of a house she had spent 3 years repairing, without once being asked to stay in it, not knowing yet that by midnight the word bought would be said to her face, in front of 30 witnesses, by the one voice in the house she had allowed herself, quietly, to hope, might never say it. The dinner began the way every dinner at Renmore began that summer, with too much silver and too little warmth, 30 guests arranged around a table long enough to seat the distance Julian kept from everyone in his own household. Eleanor sat at the foot as she always did, and Priscilla sat at the Duke's right hand as she had arranged to sit for a fortnight, and between the soup and the fish course she began. Gently, the way water begins to move before anyone notices the current. "You manage the accounts yourself, I understand," Priscilla said to Eleanor, down the length of the table, pitched exactly loud enough to carry. "How industrious you have become," she meant, how visible. Everyone at the table understood the sub-channel perfectly, the way county society always understood what was not being said better than what was. "Someone must," Eleanor said. "The estate does not balance itself." "No," Priscilla agreed, though I confess I had always understood a duchess's accounts to be her husband's affair, not her father's trade brought indoors. She smiled at Julian. "Your father managed a wool house, did he not, Mrs. Forgive me, Your Grace?" "He did," Eleanor said. "He managed it honestly, which I understand is rarer than managing it at all." A ripple of amusement went round the table, small and uncertain, the kind that does not know yet which side it belongs to. Julian did not laugh. He was looking at a letter that had appeared beside his plate some time between the soup and this moment, and Eleanor, watching him from the foot of the table, saw something she had not seen in 3 years of watching him closely. His hands, usually so still, folded the paper once, and folded it again, as though folding it smaller might change its contents. "Julian," Priscilla said, very softly, and it was the softness that told Eleanor, too late, that the current had already gone somewhere she could not see. "Perhaps this is not the moment." "No," he said, "perhaps it is exactly the moment." He stood. He did not raise his voice. That was, afterward, the detail the county repeated most, in parlours and pews for a month, the particular flatness of a man reading out a debt he had not chosen and could no longer avoid. He said that certain irregularities had come to his attention regarding the Hartwell wool concern, customs irregularities, a matter of smuggled dye and falsified excise papers going back a decade, and that the morality clause in the marriage settlement, which neither Eleanor nor, she suspected, half the room had ever read past its first line, rendered the contract void upon proof of fraud in the bride's family fortune. He said that proof had been furnished to him that evening. He said, and here his voice did finally change, dropping into something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, that he could not in honour keep in his house a wife whose family's money had been built on a lie, that she would return to her father's home in the morning, that arrangements would be made for a settlement befitting the circumstances. He did not call her the bought bride. Someone else did. A guest near the centre of the table, not unkindly, almost to herself, the words slipping out the way words slip out when a room has been waiting all evening for permission to say them. Well, I suppose the Duke's bought bride was always going to be returned, if the goods proved faulty. A little laughter followed, brittle and immediately ashamed of itself, and died as fast as it had come, because Eleanor had not moved. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not ask him to repeat himself, though every part of her wanted the single extra second that repetition would have bought. She set down her wine-glass with both hands, slowly, the way a thing is set down when a person does not entirely trust their own grip, and she looked at her husband down the length of a table that had never once, in 3 years, felt shorter than it did in that moment. "May I ask," she said, "who furnished the proof?" "It does not signify who," Julian said. "It signifies entirely who," Eleanor said. "A thing is not proof merely because someone hands it to you on a Thursday evening between courses." She looked once at Priscilla, whose face had arranged itself into an expression of delicate sorrow that did not reach her eyes. Eleanor looked back at her husband. "You will forgive me if I do not treat my father's ruin as a fact simply because it arrived convenient to someone's evening." "Eleanor, I am not angry," she said, and it was true, or true enough to say aloud, because the anger had already gone somewhere colder and more useful. "I am clear. They are different countries, and I have lived in the second one my whole life." She stood. "I will be packed by morning, Your Grace. You need not trouble yourself with the hour." She left the table before he could answer, which was its own kind of answer, and climbed the stairs with the particular steadiness of a woman counting her own footsteps to keep from counting anything else. Behind her, the dining room had gone entirely silent, the silence of 30 people recalculating, in real time, exactly how much they had ever actually liked her. She gave herself 10 minutes. She had learnt the number from her mother, years ago, in a house that had also gone suddenly and permanently colder than expected, and she had never needed more than 10, not once, not for anything, because grief given a fixed sentence learns to serve it and be done. She sat on the edge of her bed with the door closed and let it come. The full, undignified weight of it, the child's want underneath the woman's composure, want me, choose me, see me. And at the 10th minute she stood, washed her face, and opened the door onto the rest of her life. She began with her own trunk. She was folding her second gown into it, methodical, unhurried, when she heard the small sound of a door across the corridor, and turned to find Henry standing in his nightshirt with a wooden soldier clutched in one fist, watching her. "Are you truly going?" he said. It was not quite a question. 8-year-olds, she had learned, rarely asked questions when they already knew and simply wanted the fact confirmed by someone who would not lie to them. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Father said." "Your father said a great many things tonight," Eleanor said, "and not all of them will prove to be true. But yes, I am going." Henry looked at the trunk for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into his own room, and Eleanor heard, through the wall, the unmistakable sound of a small trunk being dragged out from beneath a bed, and small hands beginning, clumsily, without being asked, to pack it. She found Cecilia already awake when she went in. 5 years old and sitting bolt upright with her hair in its night plait, the locket Eleanor had once let her wear for an afternoon still, absurdly, clutched in one fist, because she had never given it back and no one had ever asked her to. "Henry says we're leaving," Cecilia said. Eleanor knelt by the bed. She did not, in that moment, think of contracts or morality clauses or a husband's cold arithmetic. She thought of a child who had stopped asking to be loved before Eleanor ever arrived, and who was now packing a trunk in the middle of the night rather than be left in a house where love had just been proven optional. "I am leaving," Eleanor said carefully. "That is what your father has decided for me. He has decided nothing at all, yet, about you. Then we'll decide it," Cecilia said, with the flat, unarguable logic of the very young, and climbed out of bed to find her shoes. Eleanor could have stopped her. She could have gone to Julian, in his study, and reasoned, argued, appealed to the plain fact that whatever he believed of her father, these were his children, and this was not their disgrace to share. She thought of it, standing in the nursery doorway, with 2 half-packed trunks behind her, and a locket glinting in a child's fist. And then she thought of Priscilla's soft voice at the dinner table, of the particular hunger in the way she had looked at Henry and Cecilia all summer, appraising them the way a woman appraises a property she intends to inherit, and Eleanor understood, with the sudden clean certainty of a column that finally balances, that leaving these 2 children behind in this house tonight was not caution. It was abandonment dressed as obedience, and she had spent her whole life refusing to be careful in ways that cost other people everything. "Pack warmly," she told them both. "We leave at first light." She did not ask permission. She sent no note to Julian's study, made no appeal to his authority, gave the household no chance to forbid what she intended to simply do. By 4 in the morning, 3 trunks stood side by side in the front hall of Wrenmore Hall, hers and Henry's and Cecilia's, packed by hands that had not waited to be told they were allowed. When Julian came down at dawn, dressed for a confrontation he had rehearsed all night in some quiet, furious corner of himself, he found not 1 trunk waiting to be sent away, but 3, and beside them his own 2 children, dressed for travel, holding hands, waiting for a woman who had never once, in 3 years, asked to be their mother, and had simply become one anyway. He stopped in the doorway of the hall. Whatever he had meant to say did not come. Eleanor watched him look at the trunks, and then at his children's faces, set with the particular stubbornness of the very young who have decided something and will not be argued out of it, and for 1 unguarded second something moved behind his eyes that she had no name for yet, and did not have time to study. "They are not part of the arrangement," he said finally, and his voice had lost its dinner-table flatness. It came out rougher than he seemed to intend. "No," Eleanor agreed. "They are not an arrangement at all, Your Grace. That has rather been the trouble in this house, that everyone in it has been treated as one at one time or another. I am not taking your children." I am refusing to leave them where I found them, alone, in a house that has just demonstrated, quite thoroughly, what it does with people it has decided are no longer useful. You may forbid it if you wish. You are their father, and the law is entirely with you. But you will have to say the words to them yourself, this morning, in this hall, and you will have to watch their faces while you say it. Julian looked at Henry. Henry looked back at him, with the flat, unafraid directness of a boy who had not yet learned to be careful with dukes. Cecilia said nothing at all, only tightened her grip on the locket in her fist, as though it might be the next thing taken from her. The silence went on a long moment. Somewhere in the house behind him, a door opened and closed. Priscilla, Eleanor thought, listening, the way she had listened all summer, from just out of sight. "The carriage is at 8, Julian said at last, and turned, and walked back into his study, and did not say the words she had asked him to say, which was, in its own way, the closest thing to an answer any of them received that morning. By 8 the carriage stood loaded in the drive, 3 trunks lashed to its roof, and Josiah Hartwell's own coachman, sent for in the night, waiting at the reins. Eleanor climbed in first. Henry climbed in beside her without being told where to sit. Cecilia came last, pausing on the step to look back once at the house that had never quite been warm, and would, Eleanor suspected, be considerably colder now, and then she climbed in and put her small hand into Eleanor's, and the carriage pulled away down the drive of Wrenmore Hall carrying, in the end, not the bride the Duke had sent for, and not the children he had failed to keep, but a household of exactly the size and shape it had always secretly been, going somewhere it could finally be honest about it. Josiah Hartwell met the carriage in his own drive at Ashcombe House 2 days later, and did not ask a single question before he had embraced his daughter, and then, with considerably more caution, the 2 solemn children who had arrived attached to her like a fact he had not been consulted on. He was a broad, plain man who had built a fortune out of good wool and fair weight, and he had never in his life pretended to a delicacy he did not possess. "They sent you back," he said, once the children had been handed off to the housekeeper for supper and warm baths, and it was not quite a question either. "They accused you of fraud," Eleanor said. "Smuggled dye. Falsified excise papers. A decade old, apparently, and never once mentioned by a single customs officer in that decade, which I confess strikes me as remarkable timing for a fraud so well concealed." She watched her father's face carefully as she said it, the way she had watched every face in that dining room, cataloguing and returning nothing until she had gathered enough to be certain. Josiah's jaw tightened once, and then went still, a man doing arithmetic he did not enjoy. "There was no fraud," he said. "I have kept every ledger of that business since I was 21, every customs paper, every excise receipt. I did not build what I built by cutting corners a man in my position could never afford to have found." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely. "Which means someone built the fraud instead, and did it well enough to hand it to a duke over dinner and watch him swallow it whole." "Priscilla Vane," her father said, without needing to be told the name, because he had heard enough of the county's talk over the summer to have already formed his own opinion of the woman, and Eleanor, watching him, felt for the first time since the dinner something other than the flat, useful calm she had been running on. She felt the beginning of the thing that would carry her through the next year, not fury exactly, though fury was somewhere underneath it, but the particular cold satisfaction of a woman who has just been handed, by her enemy's own carelessness, the shape of the fight she is about to win. "We will need the ledgers," she said, "all of them." And I will need a room to work in, father, with a good lamp, and no one to disturb me. Because I intend to find out exactly what was forged, and exactly whose hand did it. And I intend to make certain that when the truth is finally laid out, where the whole county can see it, there will be no possible way for anyone to look away from it again. Josiah studied his daughter for a long moment, the girl he had bought a title for, and sent away with such hope 3 years before, and saw, perhaps for the first time since her wedding day, not his daughter returned in disgrace, but something considerably more formidable standing in her place. "You have your mother's face when you say things like that," he said. "My mother," Eleanor said, "never let a debt go uncounted, not the ones in coin. I do not intend to either." The room her father gave her had good light and a door that closed, and within it she built over the following 6 weeks the first of the 2 campaigns that would eventually undo Priscilla Vane, though she did not yet know that was its name. She began, as she began everything, with numbers. She sent for every ledger her father's wool house had kept for the past 12 years, and beside them she laid the letter Julian had read aloud at dinner, a copy of it at least, procured through a clerk of the county customs office, whom her father had employed honestly for 2 decades, and who was, as a consequence, willing to do a favour for a woman he had watched grow up. The letter alleged a shipment of smuggled indigo dye in the autumn of a specific year, routed through a specific port, under a specific false manifest. Eleanor laid her father's own shipping records for that autumn beside it, and found, within an evening, that the vessel named in the fraudulent letter had, according to the port's own harbour log, been in dry dock for repairs the entire month in question, unable to carry so much as a barrel of water, let alone a hold of contraband dye. It was a small thing, a single date misjudged by whoever had constructed the lie. But Eleanor had learned from her father, long before she had learned it from any ledger, that fortunes are built and unbuilt on details exactly this small, and that a forger clever enough to invent a fraud is rarely patient enough to check a harbour log 12 years old. She did not stop there. She wrote, in a plain, careful hand, to 3 men who had worked for her father across those 12 years, a foreman named Walter Combe, who had run the Leeds mill floor since before Eleanor was born, a customs clerk named Peter Doyle, who processed half the county's excise papers and remembered, with the precision of a man who took genuine pride in his work, every irregular manifest that had ever crossed his desk, and a bookkeeper her father had let go years before under circumstances Eleanor now suspected deserved a second look. She asked each of them plainly whether they recalled any such shipment, any such fraud, any such year. She kept their answers, when they came, in a folder she labelled with nothing but a date, the way she labelled every dangerous thing in her life, flatly, without drama, so that its true weight would surprise whoever eventually opened it. The second campaign was quieter, and it took longer, and it began the evening Henry came to find her in her lamplit room, with a question he had clearly been carrying for days. "Will we go back," he said, "if you prove it wasn't true?" Eleanor set down her pen. "I do not know," she said, because she had promised herself, the first night in this house, that she would never once tell these children a comfortable lie in place of an honest, uncertain one. "That will depend a great deal on your father, and rather less on me than you might imagine." "He didn't ask us to stay," Henry said, "at the carriage. He could have asked." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He could have." She considered the boy for a moment, 8 years old, careful with his questions the way children become careful when they have learned that answers can hurt. "Your father is not a cruel man, Henry. I want you to understand that clearly. because it will matter later even if it does not feel like it matters now. He is a frightened one. There is a very great difference, though I confess it took me the better part of 3 years to learn it, and I do not expect you to learn it faster than I did. Frightened of what? I do not entirely know yet, Eleanor said, truthfully, but I intend to find out. In the meantime, you have Latin sums I have not yet checked, and Cecilia is refusing her vegetables again on principle. And neither of those problems requires your father's help to solve. Go on. Henry went, not entirely satisfied, but children rarely required satisfaction so much as honesty delivered kindly, and Eleanor had learned to offer exactly that in place of comfort she did not have to give. She turned back to her ledgers with the particular stillness of a woman filing one grief carefully away to make room for the work still in front of her, and did not allow herself to wonder, not once that evening, what precisely was happening inside Wrenmore Hall now, that its halls held 2 fewer voices than they had held all summer. At Wrenmore, the silence Eleanor had left behind did not resolve into peace. It curdled slowly, the way milk curdles in a house no one thinks to keep cold, and within a fortnight Julian Ashford understood, in the specific and humiliating way a man understands a thing only once it is gone, that he had not sent away an inconvenience. He had sent away the only functioning part of his household. The steward brought him accounts he did not know how to read, because Eleanor had reorganized them into a system that made sense only once you understood the mind that built it, and Julian, staring at columns his wife had kept flawlessly for 3 years, found himself unable to say with any confidence whether the estate was solvent or ruined. The nursery, without her, reverted within days to the state it had been in before her arrival, cold porridge, an absent maid, a silence where 2 children's voices used to be. He walked past the empty schoolroom on the second morning, and found himself standing in the doorway for a full minute, looking at a desk where Henry's sums used to be corrected in a hand he had never once thanked, before he made himself walk on. He did not go after her. He told himself this was propriety. A man did not chase down a wife he had, however reluctantly, sent away over a matter of family honour, not within the first fortnight, not while the accusation itself remained officially unresolved. He told himself a great many things that fortnight, in the manner of a man building a wall faster than the evidence could tear it down. Priscilla, for her part, moved into the space Eleanor had vacated with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been planning her entrance for considerably longer than a fortnight. She took over the household accounts, badly, and blamed the confusion on Eleanor's supposedly deliberate obscurity. She began speaking, in company, of the children's need for proper family guidance, now that matters had been regularized, and twice suggested to Julian, in tones so gentle they barely registered as suggestions, that a permanent arrangement for Henry and Cecilia's upbringing ought to be settled soon, given how unsettling the last months had evidently been for them. "You mean," Julian said, on the second occasion, with a coldness that surprised even him, "that you would like to raise them yourself?" "I mean," Priscilla said, unruffled, "that they are Rosalind's children, and I am the only blood relation left to them on their mother's side. And I should have thought a father who has just discovered how easily a stranger's daughter can deceive a household might welcome a guardian he could actually trust." Julian said nothing to that, but he did not say yes either, and something in his silence, some old buried instinct he did not yet have words for, made him send, that same evening, a discreet letter to his own solicitor, a precise and unsentimental man named Simon Reeve, asking him to review, quietly, the exact terms of the guardianship clauses in Rosalind's marriage settlement, and to determine, while he was at it, precisely who stood to gain what, and from whom should the children's care ever formally change hands? It was the first honest question Julian had asked in a month. It would not be his last. 6 weeks after the carriage left Renmore's Drive, Eleanor received through her father's solicitor a discreet inquiry from a Mr. Simon Reeve regarding the exact provenance of certain shipping and excise documents referenced in a letter, dated the previous August. She read it twice, standing in the hallway of Ashcombe House, with the Morning Post still in her hand, and felt something in her chest unclench very slightly for the first time in 6 weeks, not hope exactly. She was too careful a woman to call it hope so soon. But the particular alertness of a hunter who has just heard, faintly, that the ground ahead has begun to shift. She answered Mr. Reeve's inquiry within the day, with precision, and enclosed copies of everything she had gathered: the harbour log, Walter Comb's letter, Peter Doyle's careful recollection of every irregular manifest that had crossed his desk in a decade of honest work. She did not enclose an accusation. She had learned from her father that an accusation asked to be believed, while a fact simply asked to be checked, and she preferred, always, to hand a man a fact and let him do his own believing. Reeve's reply came back within the fortnight, formal and careful in the way of a man who had built his career on never overstating a conclusion, but unmistakable nonetheless. The harbour log corroborated her account entirely. The vessel named in the letter had indeed been in dry dock. There was, moreover, he wrote, a further matter he felt obliged to raise, though he wished to raise it delicately. The letter itself, upon close examination, bore a wax seal, whose device, a small griffin rampant, did not match any seal registered to the customs house in question. It matched instead a private seal once used by the late Mr. Vane, Lady Priscilla's husband, for correspondence connected to his own considerably less scrupulous business dealings before his death. Eleanor read that final paragraph 3 times. Then she sat very still for a moment, in the lamp-lit room her father had given her, and allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile she had permitted herself in 6 weeks. It was not enough yet. A private letter to a solicitor was not a public reckoning, and Eleanor understood, with the same clarity she brought to every column of figures, that a woman who had been humiliated at a dinner-table of 30 witnesses could not be quietly vindicated in a solicitor's study, and consider the debt paid. The county that had watched her called a bought bride and laughed, however briefly and however ashamed of itself afterward, would need to watch the correction too. Otherwise the correction would not exist in any way that mattered at all. But it was, she thought, folding Reeve's letter carefully into the folder she had labelled only with a date, a very good beginning. That evening, at supper, Henry asked her, as he had taken to asking most evenings, whether there was any news, and Eleanor, for the first time since the carriage had pulled away from Renmore's Drive, was able to tell him something other than not yet. "There is a little," she said. "Enough to say that someone made a mistake, Henry, and mistakes, once found, have a way of unravelling everything built on top of them. I cannot promise you what comes next, but I can promise you that whoever built the lie your father believed is going to have a very difficult autumn." "Good," Henry said, with the flat satisfaction of a boy who had never once doubted his own household's honesty, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to him, and passed his sister the bread without being asked, and Eleanor watched the two of them, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever else this year cost her, it had at least given her this, a table where children ate without fear, in a house that had never once made them feel bought. Simon Reeve did not confine his findings to a letter. He was, whatever his personal opinions of the Duke's household arrangements, a man who took his professional obligations with genuine seriousness, and a forged document circulated to dissolve a marriage settlement was, in his careful legal judgment, a matter serious enough to warrant more than a private note. He requested, formally, a meeting with the Duke, and brought with him the harbour log, Walter Combs' letter, and the small damning detail of the griffin seal. Julian read through the papers in his study with Reeve seated across from him, saying nothing, and Eleanor's careful hand was visible in every line of the argument, even though her name appeared nowhere in it. The same precision that had once reorganised his estate ledgers into cents, now turned, methodically, toward dismantling the lie that had cost him his household. He set the papers down when he finished, and did not speak for a long moment. "You are certain of the seal," he said finally. "As certain as any man can be who is not a magistrate," Reeve said. "I would recommend, Your Grace, that a magistrate examine it formally, and soon, given the gravity of what is implied." "Implied," Julian repeated. "That the letter was constructed, Your Grace." "By someone with access to the late Mr. Vane's private seal, and a motive to see the marriage dissolved." Reeve did not say the name. He did not need to. Julian's face, when he finally looked up, had gone the particular grey of a man doing arithmetic he had been avoiding for 6 weeks and could no longer avoid. "Say it plainly," Julian said. "Your aunt by marriage, Your Grace," Reeve said. "I believe the letter was forged by Lady Priscilla Vane." Julian sat with that for a long time. Outside, the estate went on without him. The harvest coming in across fields Eleanor had once walked with her account books tucked under one arm, checking yields against a decade of records no one else had thought to keep. He thought of his aunt's soft voice at the dinner table, of the letter appearing beside his plate at precisely the moment it would do the most damage, of 6 weeks of her gentle, patient suggestions about the children's guardianship, each one a small stone laid carefully on top of the last. He thought, too, though he did not say it aloud to Reeve, of his own father, 20 years dead, who had raised him on a doctrine so simple it had taken Julian 30 years to recognise it as a wound rather than wisdom. A duke does not indulge feeling. He manages assets. His father had said it first the week his mother died, standing over a coffin with a boy of 9 beside him, who had wanted, more than anything, to be held, and had been told instead to compose himself, because a title is a duty, and duty does not weep. Julian had married Rosalind at 23, believing he had learned to feel again, and had watched her die of a fever 4 years later, having never quite let himself love her the way she had asked to be loved, careful, always careful, keeping some ledger of his own heart that never balanced in either direction. He had told himself, at her graveside, that the caution had been wisdom, that a man who loved less was a man who grieved less, and he had built his second marriage on that same careful arithmetic, married a wife for her father's money, and never once entered her into any column but the useful one, because useful, unlike loved, could not be taken from him twice. He understood, sitting in his study with Reeve's papers in front of him, that he had spent 6 weeks calling his own coldness honour, and that somewhere in that 6 weeks a woman he had genuinely wronged had spent every day proving, with harbour logs and letters and a patience he had done nothing to earn, that she was exactly what he had told a room full of guests she was not. "I will need everything you have," Julian said, "and I will need it before the harvest assembly, all of it, laid out where the whole county can see it plainly, not settled quietly between solicitors where no one else will ever know the truth of what was said about her at my own table. Reeve looked faintly surprised. It was, evidently, not the response he had expected from a man whose family reputation the whole matter threatened to embarrass. "That will be considerably more public than is strictly necessary, Your Grace." "It is not about necessity," Julian said. "I said it in front of 30 people. She will not be corrected in a solicitor's office where none of those 30 people will ever hear of it." The harvest assembly at Denford was held every year in the last week of September, in the long tithe barn at the edge of the parish. And it was the one gathering in the county where gentry and tenants and tradesmen sat, however uneasily, in the same room to settle the year's accounts and disputes before the magistrate who presided over it. It was, Eleanor had always privately thought, the most honest room in the county, because money and grievance made everyone equally plain-spoken, and she had chosen it deliberately, once Julian's letter reached her requesting her presence, over any drawing-room or ballroom that might have offered a gentler stage. She arrived with her father, and with Henry and Cecilia, who had refused, both of them, with a firmness she had not tried very hard to overcome, to be left behind. The barn was full by the time they entered, tenants in their good coats, the vicar, half the gentry of Denford, and Priscilla Vane seated near the front in unrelieved black, composed as she had been composed all summer, smooth as poured cream, giving no sign that she understood what the gathering had actually been called to examine. Julian stood when the magistrate called the matter, and Eleanor watched him cross to stand not beside his aunt, where 3 years of habit might have placed him, but beside the empty space that had once, briefly, been his wife's. "I asked for this to be heard here," he said, "because I made an accusation in this county publicly, before 30 witnesses, and a public wrong deserves a public correction, however much less comfortable that is for the man who made it." His voice did not shake. It had the particular flatness she remembered from the dinner table, but turned now toward a different purpose. "I was shown a letter alleging fraud in the Hartwell wool concern. I believed it without verifying it, and on the strength of that belief I sent my wife from this house. I was wrong to believe it, and I was wrong not to have verified it before I ever spoke." A murmur went through the barn, the sound of 30 conversations restarting at once and then, as the magistrate raised a hand, subsiding again. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, "you have documents, I understand." "I have documents," Julian said, "but I would ask that the woman who found them be permitted to present them herself, since she found what I should have found months ago and did not." Eleanor rose. She had not planned a speech, had never much trusted speeches over evidence, and she gave none now. She laid the harbour log on the table before the magistrate, and explained plainly what it showed. She laid beside it Walter Combs' letter, and Peter Doyle's, and read aloud, in a voice that did not once climb or waver, the precise dates and the precise discrepancies that made the fraud a physical impossibility, rather than merely an unlikely story. She laid the griffin seal last and asked, quietly, whether anyone in the barn recognised the device. It was Walter Combe himself, sent for by Eleanor's own hand, and seated among the tenants near the back, who stood without being asked, hat in his hands, and said in his plain rural voice that he'd known that seal 30 years, that it belonged to Mr. Vane, God rest him, and that he'd have known it anywhere, having seen it stamped on more than one document in his time, that a decent man wouldn't want his name near. And it was Peter Doyle, rising after him, who confirmed that no customs office in 3 counties used a griffin device, and never had. The room's turning was audible before it was visible, a shift in the particular quality of silence that Eleanor had learned to listen for. The sound of 30 people recalibrating, all at once, exactly how much they had ever actually believed. She watched Priscilla's composure hold for one moment longer, and then watched it go, not in tears or protest, but in the smaller, more absolute collapse of a woman who understands the room has already decided against her, and that nothing she says now will be believed. "I do not ask that she be ruined," Eleanor said, before the magistrate could speak, and the barn went very still to hear her say it. "I ask only that the truth be entered plainly into the record, so that no one in this county need wonder again what was owed and to whom. What is done with Lady Vane beyond that is not mine to decide, and I find, having had 6 weeks to consider it, that I have no particular wish to decide it." She looked, once, at Priscilla, and something in her face was not triumph so much as a kind of tired, unhurried mercy. She may keep whatever dignity leaving quietly affords her. I would rather build than break. I have always rather preferred it. Priscilla left the barn before the magistrate had finished speaking, alone, and no one in Denford saw her at another gathering in the county again. The barn emptied slowly afterward, the way a room empties after a verdict everyone has been waiting weeks to hear, and it was some time before Eleanor found herself standing nearly alone near the long table, gathering her papers back into their folder, while Julian waited a few feet away, with the particular stillness of a man who does not know if he is owed the right to approach. "You did not need to ask me here," Eleanor said without looking up. "You could have settled it with Reeve, quietly, and spared us both the barn." "I did need to," Julian said. "You were wronged in front of 30 people. I was not going to correct it in front of one solicitor and call the debt paid." He paused. "I understand if that reasoning arrives a good deal too late to matter to you." "It arrives," Eleanor said, closing the folder, "which is more than I had allowed myself to expect 6 weeks ago. Whether it matters is a separate question, and I find I am not yet prepared to answer it standing in a tithe barn with my father waiting outside." "May I call on you?" Julian said. "At Ashcombe. Not tonight. When you are ready to hear the rest of it, whenever that is." Eleanor considered him for a long moment, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he had spent 30 years avoiding, and had finally, this autumn, been forced to complete. "You may call," she said. "I make no promise beyond opening the door." He called 11 days later, and Eleanor, true to her word, opened the door and nothing more. She received him in her father's small parlour, with Henry and Cecilia sent, at her insistence, to the garden rather than the room, because whatever was said between herself and Julian this first time was not, she had decided, going to be said in front of children who had already absorbed enough of adults' unfinished business for one autumn. "I did not come to ask you back," Julian said, before she could ask him to begin. "Not yet. I came to explain myself properly, which I have not done, not once, in 6 months of you deserving it." He sat, uninvited, on the edge of a chair too small for him, and Eleanor recognised, watching him, the particular discomfort of a man who has decided to be honest and has not yet learned how it is done gracefully. "There is a difference," Eleanor said, "between an explanation and an apology. I have had a great many apologies offered to me in my life, Your Grace, mostly from men who wished to be forgiven without having to understand what, precisely, they were asking forgiveness for. I find I have no further use for that kind. If you have come to explain, I will listen. If you have come only to apologize, I would rather you saved us both the hour." "I intend to do both," Julian said, "but I understand now that the explanation has to come first, because I do not think you can trust an apology from a man who has never told you why he did the thing he is sorry for." He told her then in a plain, unadorned voice that cost him visibly with every sentence, about his father, and the coffin, and the doctrine handed to a boy of 9 before he had finished grieving his mother. A duke does not indulge feeling, he manages assets. He told her about Rosalind, about 4 years of careful, rationed love that he had told himself was wisdom, and had, he understood now, simply been cowardice wearing a duke's coronet, and about a fever that had taken her before he had ever let himself love her without keeping half his heart in reserve, and how he had converted that grief, in the years since, into a colder and more absolute resolve never to be caught unguarded again. He told her that when he had looked at her across 3 years of marriage, he had seen precisely what he had trained himself to want to see, a capable, useful, well-managed asset, because useful things could not undo him the way Rosalind's death had nearly undone him, and he had built an entire second marriage on the relief of never once risking more than that. And then Priscilla handed me a letter, he said, and some old buried part of me that had never stopped being 9 years old at a coffin's edge simply believed it, because believing the worst of you cost me nothing, and believing the alternative, that I had built a whole household around a woman I had never once properly seen, would have cost me everything I had spent 30 years protecting myself from feeling. He stopped, started again. I am not telling you this so that you will forgive me for it. I am telling you because you asked for the explanation, and because I do not think there is any version of the truth that makes me look less at fault than I was. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment, in the particular quiet of a woman weighing a debt she had not expected to see itemized so plainly. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the explanation. I believe it, and I think it costs you a great deal more to say than it would to have said nothing at all, which I do not discount." She folded her hands in her lap. "But an explanation is not a returned house, Your Grace, and I find I am no longer the kind of woman who returns to anything simply because the reason for its coldness has finally been named. If you want more than my forgiveness, and I think, from the trouble you have gone to, that you do, you will have to earn it in terms I set, not terms that are merely convenient to your remorse." "Name them," Julian said, "and I will meet every one. I will keep the children's education under my own direction, wherever they live, for as long as they wish it," Eleanor said. "I will manage the estate accounts myself, openly, with my name on the ledgers, not hidden behind yours. I will not be introduced ever again in any room in this county as anyone's bought anything, and you will not tell me you have changed. You will show me, over months, not evenings, in the small, unwitnessed hours no one is watching to reward you for, and I will decide for myself, in my own time, whether the showing has been sufficient. I will not be rushed into believing it simply because believing it would be more comfortable for either of us." "All right," Julian said. "All right, then," Eleanor said, and something in the plain exchange of those 4 small words settled between them like the first stone of a foundation neither of them had yet agreed to build on, though both, in that moment, understood that the ground had at least been cleared. He did not press her further that day, and he did not return the next week expecting anything more than the door opened again. What he did instead, over the following months, was smaller and, Eleanor came to understand, considerably harder for a man of his temperament to sustain than any single grand gesture would have been. He wrote to her weekly about the estate, not instructing her but reporting to her, the way a steward reports to an owner, and asking her opinion on decisions he could easily have made without her. when she visited Renmore in November to review the winter accounts at his invitation. She found the roofs she had once repaired still sound, the tenant wages still paid in full and on time. A habit she had begun, and he had, without announcement, simply continued. She found, too, a new ledger begun in his own hand, tracking every wage paid to every worker on the estate down to the last shilling, itemised and dated with a care she recognised as unmistakably her own method, borrowed and practised until it had become his. He began coming to the nursery in the evenings, not to correct Henry's sums, which he still did badly, but to sit while Eleanor corrected them, saying little, simply present in a room he had once walked past without slowing his step. Cecilia, who had stopped asking her father for things long before Eleanor ever arrived at Renmore, began, that winter, asking him again, small things first. A story before bed, a hand to hold crossing the frozen yard, and each time he answered without hesitation. Eleanor noted it, quietly, in the private ledger she kept of him now instead of the estate, the way she had once noted every repaired roof and every honest wage. Nothing in isolation meant very much. A chair pulled up beside hers at supper, tea poured for her, unasked, before he poured his own. A silence held comfortably, without either of them needing to fill it. But accumulation, Eleanor had learned long before she had ever learned his name, was the only kind of proof she had ever fully trusted, and by the time the first snow came to Denford that December, the accumulation had become difficult, even for a woman as careful as she was, to argue with entirely. There was one evening, in February, when the old habit nearly undid all of it. Julian had made a decision about a tenant's arrears alone, in his study, without consulting her, the way he had made every decision for 3 years before she taught him otherwise, and had only mentioned it to her afterward, in passing, as though it were nothing. Eleanor set down her pen very deliberately. "You did not think to ask me," she said. "It was not a question." Julian went still, and she watched him understand, in real time, exactly what he had done. "I forgot," he said. "It is not an excuse. I simply reached for the old way of doing it before I remembered there was a new one." "That is the relapse I was watching for," Eleanor said, not unkindly, not cruelty. Habit, they wear the same coat sometimes, and it is difficult even for me to tell them apart at a glance. "I will undo it," Julian said, "tonight if you tell me how you would have decided it." "You will not undo it because I tell you to," Eleanor said. "You will sit with me now, and we will decide together what should have been decided together the first time. And you will remember, the next time a decision like this one comes to your desk alone, that the old way is no longer available to you, not because I have forbidden it, but because you no longer wish to be the kind of man who reaches for it." She looked at him steadily. "That is the whole of the test, Julian, not whether you slip. Everyone slips, whether you correct it yourself, the moment you notice, without needing to be caught." He corrected it, not because she watched him do it, but because, she learned afterward from the tenant himself, Julian had gone back to the man's cottage the very next morning, alone, and asked him plainly what he would have wanted done, and done that instead. It was March before Julian said the words plainly, in the small parlour at Ashcombe, where he had first explained himself, with Henry and Cecilia once again sent to the garden, and the fire burned low between them. "I am not going to tell you I love you," he said, "because I think you have heard men say easy words all your life, and I do not wish to be one more of them." He paused, and Eleanor recognised, in the particular careful set of his jaw, a man choosing every word before he spent it. I would choose you. That is the whole of what I have to offer, and I understand it may not be enough after everything it has cost you to hear it so late. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some months now, in 100 small ways I did not have the courage to name until this evening, and I intend to go on choosing you for as long as you will let me, whether or not you ever choose to come back to Renmore at all. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time since a summer night 3 years before, when her mother's grave had still been new, she did not count the minutes. She let herself simply feel the whole unrationed weight of it, sitting in a small parlour, with a man who had finally, after 30 years of careful arithmetic, chosen to risk the entire sum, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not need to file it away for later at all. Then choose me tomorrow, she said, when she could speak again, and the day after that, and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and I will tell you, in a year's time, whether the choosing has held. That is the only answer I have to give you today, Julian, and I think, for once, it is enough. They were married again, in the eyes of the county, if not in any church, that spring, not a second wedding, for the first had never legally lapsed, once Reeve's findings were entered into the record, but a second beginning, marked quietly by Eleanor's return to Renmore Hall, with Henry and Cecilia beside her, and her own name, this time, entered into the estate ledgers as owner. Not merely as manager. 2 years passed the way seasons pass on a well-run estate, visibly, honestly, each one accounted for. Renmore's tenant cottages were the best kept in the county by the second harvest, and the estate posted, publicly, at Eleanor's insistence, a fixed and fair wage for every worker on the land, the first estate in Denford to do so, a practice 3 neighbouring families adopted within the year rather than lose their best hands to Renmore's example. Henry, 10 now, kept his own small ledger of the home farm's accounts, taught by a stepmother who had never once let him believe numbers were beneath a duke's attention. Cecilia, 7, wore the locket Eleanor had once folded into a trunk on the worst night of her life, given to her outright the spring of the 2nd year, no longer a borrowed comfort, but a gift with Eleanor's own mother's portrait inside it, passed, deliberately, from one motherless girl to another. Julian had a second locket made that same spring, smaller, plainer, containing not a portrait, but a single pressed stem of the blue flower Eleanor had worn to the dinner, that had once nearly ended everything, and he gave it to her without ceremony, at breakfast, the way he had learned to give most things that mattered, quietly, on an ordinary day, expecting nothing in return. "You were not bought," he told her, that morning, turning the old word over at last in front of her, plainly, the way she had once turned over a column of figures until it finally balanced. "I paid a debt to your father, and received, without ever having earned it, everything that has kept this house standing since. I did not choose you at the altar 3 years ago. I choose you now, every ordinary day, and I mean to go on doing it long after either of us has stopped counting." "Then we are agreed," Eleanor said. "We are agreed," he said, and it was, as it had always been between them, the whole of the treaty either of them required. Renmore Hall, in the 2nd spring after Eleanor's return, no longer held its breath the way it once had, in the years when a cold duke moved through it, like a man auditing property he meant to sell. It exhaled now, in the ordinary sounds of a working house, children's sums checked aloud in the schoolroom, tenants paid in full at the kitchen door every quarter day, a woman's steady hand still balancing the ledgers each evening by good lamplight, no longer alone. The trunks that had once left its hall in disgrace stood now in its attic, unpacked and long forgotten, 3 plain wooden boxes among 100 others, indistinguishable from any other trunk in the county. Which was, Eleanor thought sometimes, exactly what a thing should become once it has finished proving what it was built to prove. She had stopped asking, long before that second spring, to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not through beauty, which she had never traded in, and not through anger, which she had never needed, but through the plain accumulation of work done honestly, and debts kept faithfully counted, in coin, and in every currency that mattered more than coin. A woman who builds does not ask to be valued. She simply becomes, over enough ordinary days, too load-bearing to remove. That was not a lesson the county taught her, nor her husband, nor even, in the end, her own careful mother, though her mother's voice was in it somewhere still, in the old habit finally put to its truest use. It was a lesson she had taught herself, one ledger and one winter, and one steady, unhurried year at a time, and it was, in the end, the only inheritance she had ever needed to be certain no one could take from her again.